Leif Garrett was 5 years old when his father walked out. He was 5 years old when his mother put him on a film set. By 14, he was drinking openly at industry parties, while adults watched and said nothing. His name was not even real. The industry changed it before he was old enough to spell it. For decades, people blamed Leif for every headline, every arrest, every fall. But, in his memoir, he finally pointed the finger somewhere. Nobody expected at the people who were supposed to love him most. What he said about his own mother made even his supporters go quiet. Leif Garrett did not start life as the name everyone knows. He was born in Hollywood in 1961, as Leif Per Nervik, the son of a Norwegian father, Rick Nervik, and an American actress, Carolyn Stellar. When show business came calling, his Norwegian surname was quietly replaced with Garrett, like the industry wanted a cleaner label that would sell faster. It sounds like a simple switch, but it shaped everything that followed because he grew up performing a version of himself that was already edited before he could even understand what that meant. That pressure got heavier because the family was cracking early. Rick Nervik left when Leif was 5, and that kind of absence does not sit quietly in a child's life. It leaves a gap where a steady voice should be, and in that gap, fame can feel like a substitute, even when it is not. Years later, when Leif was 16, he saw his father again, but only for about half an hour, a short, stiff meeting that could not repair years of silence. Then Rick disappeared again. They did not truly reconnect until Leif was in his 40s, which meant decades passed with no real father figure, only crowds, cameras, and adults who had jobs to do, but no reason to protect his heart. At the same time, his mother was already pushing hard. Carolyn Stellar knew the industry, and she pushed both her children straight into it, turning the home into something that ran on auditions and schedules. Leif began acting around age 5, and his younger sister Dawn Lynn was working when she was still very small. Dawn was not just tagging along behind a famous brother. She booked roles and appeared on shows like My Three Sons, Emergency, and Adam 12, so instead of a normal childhood with slow mornings and schoolyard routines, both kids lived in a grind where scripts mattered more than sleepovers, and call times could decide what their week looked like. Because the work never really stopped, even the usual teenage milestones got rearranged. Leif graduated high school at 15. And it might sound impressive until you see the real reason. It was not some calm academic triumph. It was a fast track built to clear the way for more filming, more studio time, and more bookings, because the system ran smoother when he could be treated like a full-time worker. It was a sign that his adolescence was being swallowed whole, and nobody was slowing down to ask what it cost him. By then, he had already been working for years. At 5, he was on the set of Bob U. Carol Uted, U. Alice in 1969, uncredited, but still doing real work in a real adult world. Then, the early 1970s came, and he stacked TV appearances the way other kids collect toys. Sitcoms, dramas, westerns, one after another, with his mother guiding the moves and keeping the momentum. By the time he was 10, he had built a long list of guest spots, not as a child testing out a hobby, but as a paid part of the machine. Then the roles started getting darker. In 1974, when he was 12, he starred in Devil Times 5, a low-budget horror film about a group of disturbed kids who survive a crash and end up killing adults at a snowbound resort. He played David, a character who could look calm and almost innocent while doing unsettling things. It was a strange place for a preteen to live in, even if it was only acting, because nobody seemed too worried about what it meant to have a kid pretending to murder grown-ups for entertainment. It was treated like just another job, and that attitude says a lot about how the industry saw him. Around the same time, he found himself in a world that was rough in a different way. In Walking Tall in 1973, he played Mike Pusser, the son of Beeford Pusser, inside a gritty story of violence and revenge. The film became a surprise hit, and Leif returned in Walking Tall Part 2 in 1975, and the final chapter in 1977. As he grew, his performances carried more weight. He was handling fear, anger, and grief in stories built on fights and threats. People in the business started seeing him as someone who could carry heavy material. That reputation helped him land bigger television work. By the mid-1970s, he was booking steady roles, and taking over as Leonard Unger on The Odd Couple became a real signal that producers trusted him. Replacing an established kid actor meant he had to fit the chemistry and timing fast. At the same time, he was guest starring on well-known shows like Gunsmoke and Wonder Woman, and it built the sense that he was not just lucky, he was in demand. Then, in 1975, he got his first leading TV role as Andy Karras in Three for the Road, a short-lived CBS drama where he played a teenage con man traveling with his father. The show did not last long, but something else started immediately. His look and nervous energy hit the teen audience hard, and fan mail began pouring in. Teen magazines rushed to put him on covers, posters began to spread, and the teen idol machine turned on fast. The kind of speed that can make a kid feel like he is standing still while the world runs around him. By late 1976, the frenzy was loud. Leif was about 15, and a music career was pushed forward, even though he had not been built up like a serious singer. He was handed a major record deal, and the whole strategy was clear: his image sold, and the music would be shaped to match the image. Crowds screamed, letters piled up, and adults around him kept feeding the fire because the fire made money. The problem was that the spotlight does not provide safety. It can make you feel even more alone, especially when there is no parent in the room and no steady adult saying, "Slow down." That isolation followed him into the touring life. He was sent from city to city, sometimes across countries, surrounded by managers and industry people instead of family. In later years, Leif described how that environment exposed him early to alcohol and drugs, not as a shocking one-time mistake, but as part of the adult party world he was pushed into. He also described a deeper layer of control where decisions were made to keep the brand clean, even if the real kid behind the brand was cracking. One of the most painful parts of his story is the way the music itself became another mask. Over time, Leif has said that session singer Jim Haas was used to smooth his vocals, and that on some tracks, Haas was far more than a helper, sometimes replacing much of what listeners thought was Leif's voice. He described it as hearing a record sold as his, but feeling like it belonged to someone else, while his face did the selling. And it did not end in the studio. He has also said the live shows were shaped around that same deception, with the sound engineered so the performance matched what people expected, even if it did not match what was real. Still, the hits and headlines kept coming. In 1978, his single, "I Was Made for Dancin'," became his biggest moment, climbing high on the charts in the United States and the United Kingdom. The song turned into a worldwide stampede with crowds screaming, stage rushes, and concerts that needed heavy security just to keep order. The louder the reaction got, the easier it was for everyone around him to ignore the quieter truth that he was still a teenager, trying to survive a life that never paused. As the fame peaked, the business side kept tightening its grip. Leif has said he was often treated like a product first and a person second. When he wanted to grow up musically, he described being blocked by executives who preferred the safe version that sold posters and magazines. That kind of trap can feel humiliating because it tells you your growth is bad for business, and when your whole life has been business, it can feel like there is nowhere to go. Along with the image trap, there was the money trap. He has described how tour expenses were pushed onto him, and how adults who were supposed to protect him controlled the finances while he stayed busy performing. Years later, the financial damage became part of the fallout story, with debt, legal fights, and a long stretch of rebuilding that did not match the fortune people assumed he must have kept. Leif Garrett got one of his sharpest moments on screen in 1983 when Francis Ford Coppola put him in The Outsiders. He played Bob Sheldon, the rich sock kid with a cruel edge, the one who ends up stabbed by Johnny Cade during that brutal fight in the park. The cast around him was stacked with faces that were still young but already dangerous with talent. Tom Cruise, Matt Dillon, Emilio Estevez, Rob Lowe, Ralph Macchio, and Patrick Swayze. Coppola packed them all into a gritty Tulsa story where greasers and socks crash into each other like they were built to collide. And Leif had to hold his ground inside scenes that did not go easy on anyone. He did. He made Bob feel spoiled, threatening, and real enough that you could believe he had been getting away with things his whole life. As The Outsiders approaches its 45th anniversary in 2026, the film is being rediscovered by a new generation, and Leif's performance is finally getting the respect it deserved. In recent interviews tied to the anniversary, he has called it a high point, and you can understand why. Because for a minute, he was right there in the center of something that mattered. But the years that followed did not treat everyone the same. His co-stars took off into careers that turned into giant hit after giant hit, while Leif, who had already been a teen pop heartthrob before he even had a real adult life, started fading into the background. He could act, and that role proved he could stand next to people who would later be called legends. But Hollywood kept trying to freeze him inside the pretty idol box. It was like the world wanted the poster, not the person. And the more he fought it, the more stuck he seemed. That pressure had been building for a long time. He was reportedly using cocaine by around 14. With no steady father figure around and a life where adults kept pushing work, attention, and image. The cage got tighter as the fame cooled off, and it did not help that managers and the industry were not protecting him. He had earned huge money as a kid, numbers often quoted in the millions, yet the money did not stay in his hands. By the time he was barely into his 20s, he was being described as broke and replaced, like the machine had moved on to the next phase. In 1985, he made Thunder Alley, and it almost felt like the movie was staring straight at his life. He played Richie, the lead singer of a rock band being torn apart by drugs. The story goes dark in a way that is hard to shrug off. A bandmate spirals, overdoses, and dies in bed. People called it close to autobiography, and it is easy to see why, because it came after the worst moment of his young life. The crash that followed him like a shadow. That crash happened on November 3, 1979, 5 days before he turned 18. He was driving a Porsche 914 that had been leased to his mother, after a late-night party at Roland Winkler's home. The details are always described as messy and heavy. Both of them had been drinking and taking Quaaludes, and they were headed out on the Hollywood freeway to get more cocaine. Reports said his blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. Then it happened fast. He rear-ended another car, hit the curb, spun out, and the Porsche went down a steep embankment and flipped. Neither of them wore seatbelts. Leif was thrown out and walked away with cuts and scrapes. Roland, who he had only known for about a month, got trapped inside, broke 3 vertebrae, and became a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the chest down. There is an even sharper twist people repeat about that night before the drive. Leif took the keys from Roland. He thought Roland drove too aggressive and too reckless. And even in that wasted state, Leif believed he was the safer choice behind the wheel. That choice haunted him because it was meant to prevent disaster, and it ended up sealing it. In the legal aftermath, the punishment made people furious. Even though he was only days away from 18, he was tried as a juvenile for drunk driving. The penalty is often described as shockingly light: a 1-year license suspension and a year of probation, with no jail time. Critics called it a celebrity deal, and the public anger burned hotter once the lifelong damage to Roland became impossible to ignore. In December 1984, a jury found negligence and ordered damages totaling more than $4 million. That guilt did not fade cleanly. It fed the addiction that was already there. And for years, it seemed like every time he tried to pull himself together, something else collapsed. In 2023, the rebooted VH1 Behind the Music revisited Leif's story for a new generation. The episode reminded viewers that even after the crash, the downward pull did not stop. In 1997, Leif was arrested for cocaine possession. 2 years later, in 1999, he was arrested again in MacArthur Park in a street-level sting. In January 2006, he was stopped at Pershing Square Metro Rail for not having a ticket, and police found heroin hidden in his shoe. That case tied into probation issues, and he was sentenced to 90 days in jail. Then the fight moved on to reality television, where pain became content. In 2010, he appeared on Celebrity Rehab, and it turned into one of the show's most intense arcs. Family Day got ugly because his mother was sick with lung cancer and said she would do anything to save him, including bailing him out of jail. Dr. Drew pushed back, saying that kind of rescue can keep addiction alive because sometimes people only change when they face real consequences. Leif exploded in anger, asking why anyone would let a loved one sit in a cell. And the whole thing exposed how tangled love and enabling can become when everyone is scared. On Family Day, Leif's mother, Carolyn Steller, walked into that room while battling stage 4 lung cancer. She looked fragile, but she still showed up because she could not stand the idea of her son suffering without her near him. To anyone watching, it felt like pure love, the kind that makes you swallow your fear and keep moving. Then, Dr. Drew didn't let the moment stay soft. He pointed at the pattern underneath the tears. The way she kept rescuing Leif was not healing him. It was helping the addiction survive. Carolyn had been sending Leif about $1,000 a month, stepping in whenever trouble showed up, because, to her, that was what a mother does. Leif heard something else entirely. To him, it sounded like people were blaming his own mother for his pain, so he exploded. And while his mother and sister sat there in that rehab circle, one absence kept screaming louder than any argument. His father, Rick Nervik, was not there. Years later, in 2019, Leif tried to take control of his own story with his memoir, Idle Truth. By then, he was tired of being reduced to tabloid headlines as if his life could be summed up in one ugly label and nothing else. At 58, he said enough time had passed to set the record straight. So he opened the door and showed what he says happened behind the shine. He wrote that managers faked exhaustion and cancellations to drive demand, and that teenage Leif was pushed into lip-syncing full concerts. He described a setup that used his face, his name, and his teenage popularity, while the money and control flowed away from him. And when he talked about his mother in the same memoir, he didn't paint her as cruel. He painted her as naive, almost painfully trusting. He described her pushing a 15-year-old Leif onto endless tours with shady managers she barely knew because they promised they would treat him like family. He wrote that she did not ask the right questions about missing money or what was happening in hotel rooms where booze and coke moved freely around her kid. He also described the pressure he felt to carry the family financially, the idea that he and Dawn Lynn were expected to fund the household from gigs while exploitation drained his earnings. That is where the story gets complicated, because it is not a clean villain and hero setup. He forgave her vulnerability and the way her own Hollywood struggle shaped her choices, but he still called it a common-sense failure that hurt him deeply. Even with that pain, he did not end the story with hate. He ended it with care. In the later years of her life, when Carolyn was fighting stage 4 lung cancer, she moved in with Leif before her death on September 2, 2022. It is hard not to feel the twist there. The woman who helped launch him then failed to protect him, ended up under the roof of the son, who could have walked away but did not. In interviews, Leif has described a long stretch of caregiving that lasted about 12 years, and he has called it the hardest job he ever had. Now, as he reaches his mid-60s in 2026, he presents himself as someone who finally found steadier ground. He has spoken about being sober and staying out of jail and rehab. The past he carries is still heavy, from the 1979 car crash to the arrests, the heroin lows, and the long public cycle of falling apart and trying again. The difference now, at least the way he tells it, is that he is no longer selling an image of perfection. He is stacking small wins, day after day, and he is choosing to be real even when real is messy.